Welcome to a new week, party people, and a new week means a new countdown to classic. This is a podcast that educates, informs, and gossips about World of Warcraft Classic. Each week we discuss the news, hot button issues, and content of the highly anticipated Classic servers. I'm your host, Josh Corbett, and this is a show where it's not my opinion on World of Warcraft that counts, but yours. If you're new to the show, Countdown to Classic goes through your expert input on everything relating to the sure-to-be amazing World of Warcraft Classic. Today, we're taking a little bit of a breather on the show after what was a huge week last week with the interviews with John Stats and Nano. Last week was a big one for fans of Countdown to Classic, as the show took in over 14,000 unique downloads as listeners flocked to hear about the making of World of Warcraft and the Nostalrius meeting with Blizzard. And thank you to everyone who tuned into an episode of the show and to all of you who continue to support Countdown to Classic. So, what do we have in store for you today? Well, we'll be hearing from listener Shriken in an interview all about Dire Maul, touching on tips, tricks, loot, farming, and also discussing hot button issues like potential nerfs or changes to Dire Maul that might be considered by the devs of WoW Classic. After that call, it'll be time for yet another memory lane segment, and then we'll round off with a bit of anger management and some cleanup, so stay tuned for those. But just before we get into that, if you follow the show, aka me, on Twitter at Count2Classic with the number 2, you would have seen that I made a little bit of a wager recently with another World of Warcraft podcast host, namely Thist of Lagging Balls. And the bet was over a match between Canada and Australia in the Overwatch World Cup. Naturally, I backed the Aussies, and Thist, being a proud Canadian, had the back of Team Canada. The terms of the bet were that the loser would shout out the winner's podcast on an episode of the show. And so, despite the best efforts of Team Australia in what was a very close game, I think you can see where this is going. In the name of good sportsmanship and the fact that a classic player always pays his debts, I would love to throw a bit of love and attention to Lagging Balls. Whilst there are many World of Warcraft podcasts covering all things BFA and modern World of Warcraft, nobody does it quite like Thist and Thorn over at laggingballs.com. So be sure to check them out there or search for Lagging Balls on iTunes, Stitcher, or SoundCloud. And with that, I shall consider my debt paid, and many thanks to Thist for being such a great sport and for taking me up on that friendly offer. Now, there's another podcast that I'm going to plug, but it's this one that you're listening to right now. If you're enjoying in-depth conversations that Countdown to Classic brings you on a regular basis, then please head on over to the show's Patreon page and see how you can help support Countdown to Classic to continue to bring you more interviews just like the one you're going to hear today. All the links you'll need are in the show notes for each episode. If you want to hit me up with some feedback or submit a memory lane or anger management of your own, you can always hit me up at feedback@countdowntoclassic.com as well. Please do join in on the show's amazing Discord as well. The link is in the show notes. If you can't get enough of me for some reason, then please do check out my other podcast, The Cinephiles. That's SINNERFILES.com, if you haven't already, for great comedic takes on all your favorite movies. But with all that said, let's get into it with today's in-depth interview all about Dire Maul with Shriken. Okay, we've got another caller on the line now, and who are we speaking with, and where in the world are you calling from?
Hi, my name is Shriken, and I am calling from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in the U.S.
Thanks so much for calling in, Shriken. Now, just to let everyone know, I put the call out to all the listeners recently on the show after speaking with AK all about raiding, and I mentioned that eventually on Countdown to Classic, we'll be going through every dungeon, every raid at some level in terms of a prolonged conversation about what we can find as players within all of these instances. And luckily enough, you were the first person to reach out to me and said, "Hey Josh, I know a thing or two about Dire Maul. I'd love to come on the show and talk about that." So that's the case. You're a bit of a Dire Maul veteran, is that right?
Yeah, I think I've probably farmed it more than I'd like to admit.
Okay, now, I mean, just to sort of kick things off generally, did you play back in the vanilla days, or is your experience more private server based?
Yes, I did start in November, in 2004 when vanilla was released. I started with a hunter, so I never played as a healer, as I do prefer to now.
Okay, and so you're playing around as a hunter in the vanilla days. Have you dabbled in private servers since then as well, or not quite so much?
Yes, I have. I've played a few characters on several vanilla private servers and also Wrath servers here and there.
So with all those years of experience within the game, could you somewhat give it a guesstimation, an approximation of how many freaking times you've run through Dire Maul?
I know, let's see. I know probably over 100, to be honest.
Okay. And
collectively, I know some of them. I know it's split into like 3 different parts. So north, definitely the most out of them. East, the second, and then west would be the least amount.
All right. And you definitely pointed that out to me. So what we'll be doing here is we will very much be focusing on the north and the east, and we'll put the west to the side, and maybe we'll talk about that another day. But what we'll do is I might start with, well, just a bit of a generalization. And what is it about Dire Maul? Did you find that you were running Dire Maul more than other instances, or what is it about Dire Maul that had you running it so often?
Well, I think it was time, because certain points when there were, as you know, the normal vanilla instances such as like Blackrock Depths, Blackrock Spire, Strathloam, and Skullomance, those pretty much take like the normal pattern of you start in the beginning and then you hit up every boss or skip some bosses along the way until you get to the end. And on average, they can take from 1 to upwards of 3 hours, even more. It depends on how good your group is. And Dire Maul was a change of pace, really, because some of them, especially north and east, you can complete them well below half an hour. And that just lured people in. And also, Dire Maul was a later released area and instance than all the original ones, and it offered a lot of new gear and items that people sought after.
That's right. Well, as many people would know, and for those who didn't, patch 1.3, I believe, was the one that introduced Dire Maul to the player base. And as you say, it wasn't there at the outset of the game. But you said a couple of things there that we'll start to dive into. And you said that Dire Maul was an instance that perhaps once you got a little bit familiar with it, you could even tear through certain wings in about half an hour or so. I read a funny thing whilst preparing for this chat with you, Shriken, and this was something that I hadn't seen before, but I understand that everyone has, rogue comments every now and again about everything within the game, but tell me what you think of this. I read one player who said, "I think Dire Maul was the hardest instance in Classic WoW." What would you have to say about the general difficulty of Dire Maul?
I don't think it was very hard. I think I can see how people come across with that, but I think you just needed to learn the mechanics. Once you get that down with like everything else, you know what to do and not to do. And then it just becomes almost like clockwork from then on.
Okay, so is it still a place to this day that I'm sure many people would feel this way? You have no problems whatsoever running into Dire Maul with a pickup group who you don't know and there's not a lot of communication going on. Do you still feel pretty confident tearing through it without any hiccups?
I think communication is definitely important when it comes to that. And I think also group composition is is also very important because what kind of tank you run with, what kind of healer, and what kind of DPS, all of that affects what direction, what pathing, and how you tackle each different instance, really.
Okay, so what would be your ideal group to run through Dire Maul with? And obviously we're focusing on the north and the east. There might be a different composition for the north and the east.
Yeah.
What would yours look like?
Mine would be warrior tank, priest healer, a mage, DPS, rogue DPS, and the third DPS could be like a hunter or something else that's or a warlock, I'd say.
Okay. Now, what we'll be doing is we'll break this down into a few different segments. And for everyone listening, here's how it's going to go. We're going to run through all of the encounters as a bit of blanket coverage. I know that when we talk about instance bosses, you know, a fair amount of the bosses in vanilla are tank and spank based. So if I say, you know, break down the mechanics of this fight, it's not going to be an overly interesting conversation at times. But we'll touch on a bit of everything, and I'll ask Shriken if there are any headaches that come up during many of the encounters in the instance. From there, we'll flow on to some of the loot that you might be able to pick up in Dire Maul, and then some of the quirks, such as the tribute, and then we'll go on to issues that might come up with classics, such as nerfing the farming capabilities of Dire Maul, and also when it should be released, blah, blah, blah. We'll open all those cans of worms later on. But we'll start with the simple stuff, Shriken, and then we'll get a bit more expansive later on, as we do here on Countdown to Classics. So Dire Maul East. Let's say you and I, we've jumped into a pickup group. We've got 3 friends with us. We go, right, let's go East Wing first. Now, the encounters that we're going to run into, and please, for God's sakes, tell me if I get any of these wrong, but this is my understanding. We've got Pusillan, Zevrim Thornhoof, Hydraspawn, Lethendris, and Alzin the Wild Shaper. That sounds about right to you?
Yes.
Fantastic. Now, let's put you in that scenario that I described before. Let's say for some reason you and I haven't met and we're with 3 randoms. It's basically a pickup group. And let's say that, you know, we're talking to each other, but we're not exactly the world's best drilled military unit here. Are any of those encounters going to give us a little bit of a headache? And if so, why?
The only thing is, if you're just looking to do East and not any of the other ones, then you can possibly ignore there's an imp in the beginning of Dire Maul East. So eventually you have to follow him to a certain point in the instance, and he'll turn hostile, and you have to kill him to get the Dire Maul key, which will grant you access to north and west. So if you want to omit that from the instance right now, everything else is it can be tricky, because how you should run, I think Dire Maul East is jump runs. So you have to basically know your position from other NPC positions to prevent aggroing to the group. So right when you enter the instance, you're on a higher floor. Then there's a forest floor below you, and you would jump down onto the floor. You would take pretty much about 80% of your health and fall damage. And from there, you have to hug the walls, and following the walls, you would get directly towards a room outside where Hydraspawn is. And there, on that forest floor, there are a great amount of packs of elementals and different mobs that will aggro if you get too close or if you're not hugging the wall.
Okay, so you've just spoken a little bit about, you know, trash mobs and packs of mobs throughout Dire Maul East. What are your general thoughts on the trash in Dire Maul East? Is it a breeze, or is there any particular mob that you're like, oh, fuck this guy?
There are headaches for sure, because there are Dire Maul introduced demons and elementals more so than the normal other instances. So, and some of the demons are actually stealth. So, so sometimes they'll just pop up on you.
Let's say we get to all of these boss encounters. If you had to pick one of the bunch who's probably going to be the toughest encounter, is it easily Alzin the Wild Shaper, because he's the last one that you bump into? Sorry, Alzin the Wild Shaper is the last one, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
So Alzin the Wild Shaper, is that easily the toughest encounter, or is it actually maybe one of the other ones?
I would say, yeah, he probably is the easiest one. One of the hardest ones. There's another one that's a demon. I forget his name. Do you mind listing through them?
Was it, are you thinking of Pusillan or Lethendris, Hydraspawn, Zevrim?
I think Pusillan. He's a demon that selects a random person in the group to be put on the sacrificial table, and if you don't have cooldowns as a tank, or if you're a healer and you manage to be the target, then your party or tank might die, and that could possibly cause a wipe. Alzin, the Wild Shaper at the end, he is troublesome because he puts a mana drain poison on healers mostly, or DPS, and he could refresh that, and that's also really annoying.
Well, you use that word. Yeah, sorry, keep going.
Sorry. Also, at the end, he spawns a horde of like demon imps that comes out after he dies, so you have to take care of that too.
You use that word annoying, and is it fair to say that the encounters in Dire Maul perhaps are just more annoyances than anything that will really make a veteran group sweat?
Possibly, yeah, I would say so, because you can do it the normal way where you try to kill everything along the way to the bosses, or a lot of people like myself, we like to be risky and try to ignore as much as possible and just focus on the bosses. I think at a certain point, I think it's after Lethendris, you do have to talk to a treant or a tree elemental in the middle of the forest floor. You can choose to kill the roaming packs of elementals to get to the tree, or you yourself or a stealth player could go to the tree in the middle, and what he does is he breaks down a door to Alzin for you. So you can either be slow and clear out the wandering, the patrolling packs, or risks, I guess, aggroing the trash mobs, trying to get to them, trying to talk to them. Okay,
now let's say we've torn through Dire Maul East, and now we turn our attention to Dire Maul North. We've obviously got, it's arguably the better known wing of Dire Maul with the tribute run that comes with it and things like that. We'll get to that later on. But just the encounters, we've got old favorites, all of them. Guard Moldar, Stomper Krieg, Guard Fengus, Guard Slipkick, Captain Cromcrush, King Gordok. Tell us about these encounters. Is there any of those that you would say tactics actually do come a little bit to the forefront of a group's thinking?
So if you're going normal versus tribute, then there's different tactics for both. If you're doing normal, I think the hardest one is Captain Cromosh, I believe his name is.
Cromcrush, yep.
Yeah. And he is just a very hard-hitting boss, and he has a fears that your tank, if you don't have if you're Alliance and you're a Dwarf Priest, if you don't have Fear Ward, if you don't have Tremor Totem, or if you're, I think mechanically you want if you know the fight or before going into it, your tank will have to queue up Enrage before he fears, because right when he fears, he drops aggro and he goes to the next person on the aggro table, and you don't really want that because he could pretty much one-shot healers or any other DPS. And outside of that, when he gets he has Immortal Strike, so that's the burden on healing already. And halfway through his health pool, he summons two melee mobs that you'll have to CC somehow. So I think he is the toughest fight in the entire North instance.
Outside of Captain Cromcrush, are all the others a cakewalk, would you say, or?
Well, I think this is done on private servers, but for Cho and King Gordok at the end. So what people normally do is there's a lower ring up, like kind of like a stone stage that he's on next to certain pillars. So, and outside of that, there's a higher another higher stage at another level surrounding the lower one where King Gordok is on, and you want the range to go up on the outer ring, and you want to tank King Gordok on the edge where the healer can still be in range of the tank on the lower stage and platform. So what you do, the strategy there is the tank needs to build enough aggro on King Gordok before he stuns, because he does have a stun. And what the strategy is, usually if you do a normal tank inspect, you would have to deal with Cho as well, and you can't CC him. So the strategy here is the healer grabs aggro from Cho through healing alone, and Cho would take a long time to have to circle around, and go up the ramp to where the healer is. And if you haven't done a significant damage to King Gordok by that point, the healer can jump down and cause Cho to run back around a second time to try, and then you could just kite him, and then that's pretty much a breeze at that point, I would say. But you'd need to know that strategy to make it easier.
Okay, now let's say we've torn through these two wings. Now let's talk loot for just a second. Are there any pieces of loot for any particular class that you think are standouts of this instance?
Yeah, I would say so. I know brightly glowing stone in North that drops off the king. That's the best offhand for a healer from a normal instance. I think the only thing that beats it is an offhand that you can grind in Alterac Valley. That's one of them. I know there's also Barbarius Blade and Leggings of Destruction. Those are the best in slot for hunters until endgame raids. There's also, let's see, Tarnish Elven Ring. Tanks needed for the hit. Rogues and hunters needed as well. That's best in slot. There is a very small percentage from the tribute chest to drop Trenchbane, which is an epic two-handed axe. I've only seen it drop once personally, but I've seen several people with it, and that's a really good two-handed weapon for I guess red paladins or warriors. But I think with the introduction of with Dire Maul loot, it just changes the best in slot list for almost every class across the board, because every class and every benefits from loot, and every class wants to run it, because there's always also Staff of Ogre Magi. All DPS casters want that as well.
Okay, outside of those pieces of obviously armor and weapons, are there any kind of materials that players can look forward to being, rather abundant in Dire Maul? And we'll talk about the farming avenues soon, but more just, let's say I'm not particularly going there to farm on the solo run, but I'm there with a group. Is there something that I'll, happily find a lot of if I'm trying to make or craft certain things in Dire Maul?
Well, books, Libram books are quite abundant. They drop numerous amount of times per run. Those you can complete those in the library in Dire Maul North for enchantments on certain armor pieces. I know that's farmable, and that just drops while running. Let's see, it's a good place for cloth. It's I know you could possibly have the chance while normally running one of the class specific trinket books, or even Forer's Compendium for Kelsarar. Okay.
Now, that's kind of the general blanket coverage of Dire Maul. We've glossed over the bosses, we've glossed over the loot. That's all good. We can find that information online. You've done a great job of explaining it with some tactics and everything as well. You're doing so well. Thank you so much, Shriken. But now I'm going to push you a little bit, and we're going to get a little bit more nitty gritty here as we get to the hard questions, and I put you on the hot seat a little bit, and we'll talk about those areas that we discussed at the top of the call. And I want to start with the tribute runs. If you could just explain to people why it is that tribute runs are so popular and what you thought of them.
Tribute runs are popular because Dire Maul North is the loot table. I think offers I guess it's like I think it's the highest level part of Dire Maul. So and also an efficient group can run tribute run like 15 minutes or less. That is insane for a full instance. And people want to run tribute because at the end, I don't know if you're not familiar with tribute runs, the more bosses you skip until the end, and for every boss you skip until the end, there's an extra piece of rare loot in the tribute chest. And outside of people running that, people run it just for the buffs that you gain for that before you go into run Molten Core or Blackwing Lair, whichever. People run it to get buffs too from the bosses that you.
How many tribute runs will you say that you've been a part of?
Oh God, probably over like 150, I would say.
Wow, and the majority of those being run through in about 15, 20 minutes?
Definitely below 15 or under, I'd say.
Okay. Now, what were your thoughts as a player when I think it's fair to say it's a little bit of a wrinkle in the system with what Blizzard did with introducing this way in which to run an instance. How did you receive this notion of the tribute run as a player? Did it blow your mind, or are you pro it? Are you against it? How do you generally feel?
I am all for it. Because like I said, you do need a certain type of composition to run it as fast as I said you would, and you do need to know the pattern and the pathing that you need to do. Otherwise, it can be really punishing because the trash in there do hit hard. And if you mess up a certain part of it, you can potentially wipe, because if your goal is to do a tribute run and you accidentally aggro a guard or any other boss, you're just forced to die and wipe and start from the beginning.
What are your thoughts on world buffs in general? Obviously, world buffs is something that's rather pertinent to Dire Maul. And just now, I'm starting to see more backlash than I ever thought I would see against world buffs. It's something that I thought the vast majority of people were rather pro. You know, it's part of vanilla. You go to certain places, you get these world buffs. More in the last month or so, I've really come across more forum posts than I thought I'd see about, you know what, maybe it's time to scrap world buffs. What are your thoughts?
On this one, I guess I'm pretty neutral. I can see where people come from because they are definitely exploited to the fact where, like for example, the Song of the Flower in Felwood, people just have you have like 40 people on countdown in Discord saying like 3, 2, 1, click. And I guess Blizzard's original design was not to have 40 people in a raid to receive that buff. You know, they probably decided, this person came across this corrupted wildflower. They cleansed it and they got the buff as like a reward, but they didn't expect people like a 40-man raid to exploit it, to have everyone to have it. And then you go on to, I would say the like Onyxia buff, that is fair because you did have a raid. You know, kill Onyxia, you got the head, you can coordinate everyone getting that buff. That's fair. For Dire Maul, I guess it's more work than the Felwood Songflower, because I was in a guild where you had multiple people running multiple groups of Dire Maul North tribute, and then what you would do is you would clear to all the trash mobs, so that to the end you would talk to and you talk to the last guy, and on your way out you would get all the buffs, and then you would hearth to Kargath or Thorium Point, so you were ready. Yeah. So I'm kind of neutral. I mean, I think it depends on how hardcore the guild is, because all hard like serious guilds will do it, and they will get the benefit of having it, and it will help them progress. faster because it really is significant. And more casual guilds will, if they don't do it, then they are lacking that advantage, I would say.
Do you have any fond memories in terms of, do you have one particular tribute run that really stands out in your mind, or something funny happened, or it all fell to shit because of something stupid that someone did? Anything that stands out as a memory from a tribute run?
There was definitely ones where I wanted to like show off like how, because I played a priest and especially can make a Dire Maul run, like it could make or break it. And I wanted to show off one time to like be like, oh, look at me, this, follow my lead, and this is how fast it could be. And it definitely, I feel like I wiped 4 times and I did not get my point across that I wanted to do.
Very good. Now, the last thing I'll just clean up on the tribute runs is I've seen arguments for don't touch anyone except King Gordok, and then I've seen arguments for take out Gordok and one other. What's your general preference?
Well, I think I personally would prefer just King Gordok because, well, unless you have someone in your group that needs another piece of item and you're just helping them along, from one of the other guards, really. Cause I know King Kong drops like, a belt that has, healers want the boots that drop off of King Kong. Rogues and possibly warriors want the +5 dagger skill, that belt that drops off him too. I personally prefer just the King Gordok at the end. It just makes it so much faster. Just
to move on to one last thing we haven't mentioned yet. Sorry, just to get back to something in my notes here. How familiar are you with the kind of loot that you can get in Not Thimblejack's cache?
Oh, the goblin? Yeah, I'm pretty familiar.
What are your thoughts on that little fun thing to trip upon within the instance?
Well, when Dire Maul gets released, you do want to be the few lucky ones that get the epic patterns that drop that you can loot from there. You can sell that, or you can learn it, and that'll pretty much help you along with making gold. I know I'm not sure if Hide of the Wild. I think Hide of the Wild might drop from it.
Yep, Hide of the Wild's one of them.
Yeah, I know Belt of the Archmage and other ones also drop from it. Yeah, Hide of the Wild especially, I think, is probably the most sought after one because it is the best healing cloak up until even the end of EWL, I'd say.
Yeah, there's some pretty, in my opinion, I think there's some pretty cool patterns there that make it well worth your time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, moving right along. Going back on track let's talk about one of the other big things, the biggest thing perhaps that we talk about when we mention Dire Maul, and that's the issue of farming. And we'll get a bit more into your personal thoughts on what Blizzard perhaps should do with the farming of Dire Maul in Classic. But I'll just open it up with a general, before we get into the pros and cons and the ethics of MMO design and whether it's an abuse of the system and blah, blah, blah. We'll fall down that rabbit hole soon, but we'll open it up with this question from listener Nostalgia Dad. And this is more about, how to do so. So Nostalgia Dad asks, about efficient farming methods in Dire Maul North and Dire Maul East. I'm aware that mages can do it, but I've seen people talking about AoE farming Dire Maul East lashes as a priest with Holy Nova, or as a paladin. I'm wondering what Shriken has to say about that. So I guess the question is more generally, outside of the classic mage AoE farming, what options are there for other classes in Dire Maul to go and have a go at farming?
Yeah, for sure. I've definitely done the Holy Nova farming in Dire Maul East, where you jump down and there are non-elite lashers that you can farm with. Just I think you need someone with a class as a consistent AoE. Like, I think mages, yes, of course. Possibly warlocks, hunters, I could possibly see. Priests can do it. The only thing about priests, I think, is you do have to have a specific spec or talents to have, and then maybe tweak the gear a little bit so you can survive longer in case like if you don't have enough stamina or anything. But yeah, they could definitely do it. I've also seen, like, even though this took a long time, a solo hunter kill, do Dire Maul North themselves, and then do the entire tribute themselves.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah.
Well, on that hunter point, you just mentioned when you were listing some of the classes that could, have a go at the farm, and you said hunters possibly. The one thing that I've seen all through the forums is that hunters seems to be the main one outside of mages. You got mages number one, and then a lot of people say, oh, hunters destroy farming Dire Maul. This is from my recollection. So when you say possibly, I'm more wondering, because I've always scratched my head and thought, are they still talking about the lashes? I'm not 100% sure. Is it that hunters would go through and torch the lashes with their pet? Or I'm not really sure why hunters would own Dire Maul.
I haven't personally done it with a hunter, but I know they can farm certain bosses in Dire Maul. They can even do the tribute themselves. So they could be referring to that. I know they have the spells necessary to farm lashers as well. I just personally haven't done it myself.
Too easy. I presume it's more, I've always interpreted it as kiting bosses as opposed to, because I'm just trying to remember if they were talking about the lashes, I'd be a little bit surprised. I don't know, but that's me.
I mean, they do have their explosive traps. They have volley. And if they kill a few and their pet dies, they can always reset with faint death and res their pet and go again. So you could do that too as well. Yeah.
No, true. And if anyone's listening who wants to absolutely is jumping up and down mad right now because two non-hunters are wondering how hunters can destroy Dire Maul, please call into the show. But anyway, we'll move along. And I guess what I should say is we'll do one more layup question in terms of, I've put the cart before the horse, and we've just talked about what classes can do the farm. If you very, very briefly can just explain, and I know a lot of people can go up and look at this online, but if people are listening who are scratching their heads going, what the fuck, these guys keep saying lashes and Dire Maul East, like what's going on? What is the lashes farming run? The
lashes farming run is pretty much there's these small little group of like flower elemental non-elite ones. They hang in about packs of like I don't know how many, like 10 or so on the, like I said, on the forest floor. Once you get into Dire Maul East, you have to jump down to the forest floor, and then there's just multiple packs of lashers, and these are just like level 55 plus non-elite. And they have relatively low health compared to everything else in the instance. And if you have a consistent AoE that you can farm these, and they have a high chance of dropping like grays that you can vendor, greens, even what people really want are like the trinket books or the forest compendium. And they just have a good loot table that you can just vendor or possibly get something out of to sell.
Okay, now let's get into the hairy part of the interview, where I'm going to ask you a few things about your thoughts and feelings on whether or not this should change in Classic. And I'll read you a couple of posts that I found on the WoW Classic subreddit and also the WoW Classic official forums. And please just bear with me, as this will take a little while as I just read this out. But listen up, and I'll ask you some questions when we're done. So the first one comes from a user Axros over at the WoW Classic subreddit, and Axros says this: I can't really say what I think Blizzard will do with Dire Maul because we don't exactly have a track record to work with here, but I do believe that they should nerf it. One of the things that I enjoy about Vanilla's farming is that you can put a lot of thought into optimal farming spots based on circumstances. For a large part, people will spread out naturally amongst themselves, as nobody wants to farm in a crowded area. But instance-based farming methods circumvent this entirely. There's no limit to the number of people that can use it, and no real way of getting disturbed. A method like that shouldn't be superior to a premium farming spot, even when that premium farming spot is uncontested. P.S. I'll be playing mage either way, so I'm just shooting myself in the foot by saying this. And I'll read you one more from user Lemon Toga, who says this: I agree wholeheartedly. As a druid who takes full advantage of Dire Maul East farming on private servers, I sincerely hope that Blizzard nerfs it. I feel like it goes completely against the whole idea of an MMORPG, that you can progress at such a fundamental task, making money, completely alone inside your own instance, separated from the world. I would much rather be forced out into the world when I want to make money. Before I learnt about Dire Maul East farming, I used to run all around the world looking for spots to fish and gather herbs. I would do laps around Ashara, Ungoro, and Winterspring looking for Dreamfoil and Mountain Silver Sage. I ran into other players and had many encounters with members of the opposite faction, leading to some awesome PvP fights over herb nodes. And all the money I made was from selling those herbs and fish to other players through the auction house, rather than vendoring it all to some NPC like with Dire Maul East. I agree with the other comments here that instance farming that's this effective is borderline an exploit. And I definitely don't think Blizzard intended for anyone to use instances this way. I very much so hope that they nerf it somehow. And just one last one before I get to my question for you from user Give Me a Drink, who says this. It's pretty dumb that the most efficient way to farm gold is to kill irrelevant trash mobs in instance content. It's totally contrary to the idea of what an MMORPG should be. So, I've just read you 3 pretty full-on anti-farming posts there. Mm-hmm. So, my question for you mainly is, do you agree with what you've just heard in those posts? And do you feel that this is somewhat of an exploit in the game?
Yes and no. I think Blizzard could definitely, they could tweak the loot tables to lower drop rates of vendorable items. And that would, kind of balance out how much certain classes have gold and otherwise. But it is, I want to say that, everyone really depending on what class you roll, and that kind of determines your farming ability, right?
Yeah, definitely.
You could re-roll a mage or so and do that. It takes a lot of it's not fun. I will tell you that for sure. Farming the instance trash, depending on what instance it is, you need to know how to do it. And at times it's really boring, but you can re-roll a mage or something. Other people did it. I can see how they feel like it could be unfair because a class that does it better than they do can just go into an instance and make lots of money. I feel like that's part of the class though, too. Because mages have the ability to mass pull, when they get to a certain point, they can mass pull to just AoE farm to level. And that alone gives them huge amount of gold and other vendorable items. So it's the only difference is they're safe. They can't be contested. But, I guess I'm on the fence on this one. I'm okay with it because I expect it and I go in knowing. The only thing I would be for is if they're getting a ridiculous amount of high drops from a really good loot table from the Lashers or even the packs of dogs in Dire Maul North. I even know before Dire Maul came out, the place to farm I think was Blackrock Depths. You can farm the elites or the dogs in there too. So if it wasn't for those, I think people would figure out where would be the best place to farm anyway, and then it would just be a constant thing of it's unfair or it's not good enough. I just think Blizzard could tweak the loot tables a little bit to make it less attractive, but I think people are going to do it regardless.
You've almost taken the words out of my mouth there, because I'm glad you mentioned that people are just going to find other avenues perhaps to farm gold, because as we do here on Countdown to Classic, I give both sides of the coin. So I've just given you a few posts that are anti the farming in Dire Maul. Now I'll give you a few that are pro the farming, which would basically be interpreted as no changes. So you're on the fence. Let's see if anything I'm about to say sways you a little bit. Okay. So just a couple of quick ones. First from user BTW I'm Mario, who says this. Honestly, as a warrior main, fuck it. Nerf that bullshit. But really, some fucking private server player with 12 years of experience behind them will know the 5th best way to farm gold in vanilla, and then you'll have to ban that also. Gold is important in vanilla, but every class has a viable spec to farm dirty gold. So why start fucking with shit? And next we have this post from user Treasure33333 who says this. Yep, people just don't know and are delusional that they'll ban a few methods and it's all going to be fixed. I played most of the classes by now and I've always found some abusive method to make gold on every class. It's nothing like cheating or anything like that. But you ban these 5 methods, there's going to be 5 new best methods that become abused to farm gold, and that's absolutely going to happen. So you touched on that, Shriken, in your response earlier. Do you feel that as players, you take something away from us, we're just going to find a new way to get around your rules?
Yeah, pretty much. People will be able to find the weirdest things or areas that people never thought of and find ways to exploit things. That's just when you have so many people playing a game, you're gonna think everything's gonna be exploited in one way or another. So the only thing they can do is make it a little bit less rewarding, not take it out completely, but just make it less rewarding, honestly. And kudos to the guy who plays the warrior, because warriors can't farm for shit at all. No matter what spec you play.
Definitely right. Now, look, if I very quickly, I hate to get violent on you, Shriken, but if I had to put the proverbial gun to your head and I said, all right, change or don't change Dire Maul for Classic, what would you do?
Don't change.
Okay.
If you're going to make Classic, keep everything the same.
Okay, all right. Let's move on to the next topic now, and this is something that comes up as well with Dire Maul, and it's the effect that it had on gear in the game. Now, as we mentioned, Dire Maul was not there from the outset. It wasn't there in November 2004. It came in patch 1.3, and obviously with the inception of a new dungeon came new gear. And people often have wondered how it fit into the grand scheme of things in terms of how it affected your pre-raid BIS selections, and also how it affected your performance in raids from then on as well. Now, and also how it potentially trivialized other dungeons pre-raiding. So I'll read you a couple of posts just about this topic and get your thoughts. And the first one is this one from a user Undoer who says this. Dire Maul trivializing earlier raids is fairly Blizz-like. Dire Maul was launched 4 months into the game before Blackwing Lair was released. Ragnaros was killed for the first time a month and a half later by Ascent. Dire Maul was probably designed for Molten Core and Blackwing Lair gear. Would you agree with that?
What do they mean for it, though? Like, as a stepping stone to it, or...
I'm interpreting that as a stepping stone to Molten Core and Blackwing Lair. I think that's how I'm reading it.
Yeah, I would say, yeah, because a lot of people's pre-raid biz comes from Dire Maul. I would say stat-wise, I appreciated the change. I appreciated the loot table and the gear that comes from it, because before, warriors had to have a certain number of defense cap, and there were this and this and this that you can only get from certain instances. And then with the release of Dire Maul, there were, other gear that had defense on it too. So you could kind of play around with your gear a little bit. You can change some things up to have more stamina, and then it gave you more options. And yeah, I thought it was a good change. And especially since the gear in it is really good, that it will help you in the long run in Molten Core, obviously. So yeah.
Sorry, scratch what I said before. I've just, upon rereading it then, what I actually think they're saying now is that the Dire Maul gear was probably designed to have actually been more available in Molten Core and Blackwing Lair, because what they're saying is basically it's not a coincidence that Ragnaros was killed for the first time shortly after Dire Maul's release. So they're saying that it probably would have fit better in the loot table of Molten Core or BWL. So would you disagree with that?
I would disagree with that, yeah. The gear in it is good, and there are some of it that you don't replace until Blackwing Layer. But I think that was just the options available to you within Molten Core. And you're honestly raiding with 40 people, maybe less, depending. You're doing these raids, and like there's only so much options you have before going into them. So loot is spread, like only several people a night are going to get loot, depending on how far you're progressing into it. So, and you're not always guaranteed like loot. So like, I think some of the Dire Maul loot is just as good, but as just as good as some gear that you might get in Molten Core. But, I think it was just like the availability of the loot table in Molten Core. Like it wasn't balanced for example, like Fury Warriors or DPS Warriors only need a few handful of items from Molten Core. Half the time they're going just for to DPS, and they don't expect to get anything out of it because if a weapon does drop, that's what they're in for, a weapon or a ring or some off pieces. There's no like main pieces that they actually need in Molten Core until later raids. So I guess, yeah, I don't think it was to replace gear in Molten Core BWL. I think it was just like it gave balance to the gear, I want to say.
Okay, now just to tie off on this point, I'll read you the following two posts that disagree with each other, and I think I know which way you're going to lie, but here we go. We'll start with this one from user Rob Mox, who says this. It still makes the gear progression pretty wonky. Dire Maul makes UBRS, LBRS, and BRD somewhat irrelevant since you can get better gear from an easier dungeon more quickly in DM. And Strat/Skolo are far more difficult, and at that point are only really worth running for the Dungeon 1/Dungeon 2 set pieces. And then we have this one from user Casper724 who says this. None of that is true, man. There are still tons of reasons for people to run dungeons other than Dire Maul. BRD, you've got the Hand of Justice, the best warrior trinket in the game, and Iron Foe. In UBRS, Dal Ren / Briarwood Reed / True Strike Shoulders / Fell Striker. So, I guess my question from those two posts is, what side of the fence do you sit on there? Do you feel like Dire Maul makes other dungeons irrelevant to a certain degree?
Yes and no. I think for certain pieces of gear, there are no better options that the other instances provide, and Dire Maul is like the best option you can get. But you can't make your complete set of gear from Dire Maul alone. You still have to go to like every single one of the other instances. You still have to farm them. All the other instances still offer things that people want, and people still do farm. For example, Scholomance, the trash in there drops Dark Runes, which is on a separate cooldown from mana potions. All healers, maybe some mages, want to farm it just for that. And Strat Live, they drop orbs that use for Crusader enchants. There's certain patterns that drop from endgame bosses in Scholomance, and especially endgame bosses in Strat Live. There's flask recipes that are all spread out too. I think Blizzard did a really good job to not make Dire Maul make the other ones obsolete. Even with the release of Dire Maul, everything is still needed. Everything's still on farm.
One last post just to tie off the call in general, and this is from Brutane over at the official WoW Classic forums, who says this. No changes. Time release Dire Maul. Now, Shriken, I would ask you, what are the potential pitfalls of having Dire Maul available upon release of Classic, and explain to people why, if you believe so, it should be time released as it was back in the day?
So Dire Maul gear definitely does help, and especially the buffs help. World buffs and world buffs combined with consumables, make Molten Core really can make it a breeze. And I think if you make Dire Maul available instantly upon release, there'll be a lack of competition in end game content and just progression in general. It might cause a stagnation, because if you have it released immediately, then people who play private servers can just farm the gear they need, go into it, just get Molten Core on farm in the first few months, and then what do they do? They just keep farming it, and then they're just farming consumables on their off time, or they're rolling alts, and then they're just waiting for the next content to be released. There's no challenge to them anymore. If you make it so Dire Maul gear isn't available, you give them more of a challenge. It's harder. The game is harder. So you just have, and if you do have it on release, you're basically separating the gap between people who played on private servers and people who didn't. So then you'll just have people who look at guilds who have like leaps of bounds of gear way much higher than them. And that can cause a sway across the board, even in like PvP and everything. You'll just have people with the better gear being better PvPers and stuff. So yeah, I agree with the time release of Dire Maul.
Okay. Now, we're not really touching on Dire Maul West in any way, because as you said, it's the one that you've probably run the least of the three wings. But just quickly, I'll just ask you a listener question that's popped up in chat and see if you have any thoughts on this one. And feel free to, if you're not too sure, by all means, please just put your hand up and say, I'm not too sure about that one. But I'll read you again one from Nostalgia Dad, who says this: Dire Maul West in particular can be really hard when you get into undead/stealth pulls. Ask Shriken about those and what his thoughts are about doing it without a priest healer for shackles.
Oh God. Yeah, you definitely need a priest healer. It's hard if you don't have a priest healer. Even not just for shackle, but the ghosts have AoE shadow spells that you need the shadow protection that helps mitigate the damage. I guess if you were running with any other healer, try to get a hunter or a warlock, because Dire Maul West has a lot of elemental groups, so banishes help. And maybe even having a warlock voidwalker to off tank. Hunters for sure, so you can trap extra mobs. At that point, your healer and tank need to play smart. When you're like not healing, you need to like outrange the spells, or try to LOS as much. At that point, it's about positioning. Try to be LOS of the trash, but not or boss, and not your tank or other party members. So you just don't get hit by unnecessary damage. But yeah, I'm all for priests as like the best healer for running dungeons, basically.
Okay. And with that, I think that about covers Dire Maul. Shriken, thank you so much for calling in. I can't thank you enough. You've been such a delight to talk to, and it's pretty clear that you do know this, this dungeon inside and out. And thanks for basically providing your wisdom on this particular area of the game with all the listeners of Countdown to Classic. Thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Josh.
And that's the call with Shriken done. Thank you so much to him again, and I do hope that all of you enjoyed going over the ins and outs of Dire Maul. Just a reminder that Shriken was featured on the show because he was brave enough to answer a call that I put out looking for specific dungeon experts. If you feel that you've run Scholomance more than anyone else in the world, if you think that no one knows Molten Core like you do, etc., then please do send me a message at feedback@countdowntoclassic.com or PM me on the show's Discord to put your name down on the list of resident veterans who are happy to speak about a specific topic at some point in the future on Countdown to Classic. But now that we've just started scratching that nostalgic itch for all of you, how about we keep it going with yet another dose of Memory Lane? On Memory Lane, Countdown to Classic comes to you with some of the listeners' fondest or funniest memories from back in the days of vanilla. So we start today with listener Romani, who tells us this. My favourite memory in vanilla was when my brother and I played on my Ev as two rogues, Alliance Night Elves, and that was probably the only iteration of WoW we ever played as Alliance. My Ev at the time was a PvP realm, I believe, and with how tight-knit a lot of communities were back then, my brother and I were known on the Horde side as complete savages when it came to world PvP. Once our guild had cleared all of BWL a handful of times post-patch 1.6, and my brother and I had gotten fully geared, we decided to take a break from hardcore raiding and completely switch over to PvP. From that point on, it became a daily addiction for us to spend hours having one of us obliterate lobies to lure in a handful of level 60 Horde players, thinking they're looking for just one rogue. Keeping in mind we were both geared to the teeth, that's when the slaughter began. It didn't matter if they sent 2 or 20 at us. It was nearly impossible to keep track of two rogues vanishing and blinding you constantly before being ambushed from behind and being practically one-shot. I had a little more experience with PvP at the time, and Alterac Valley had just come out in the prior patch, so we decided to get crazy and attempt to push me towards Grand Marshal. We convinced a few guildies to join us as the guild as a whole put raiding on hold until Zul'Gurub came out in the next patch. For almost 3 straight weeks, we spent endless hours pushing through AV wins and farming kills as much as possible. I think I'd amassed nearly 20,000 honourable kills, and a good number of dishonourable kills, before all was said and done. The end of August rolls around and Field Marshal, rank 13. 1 rank short of Grand Marshal. I was so salty at the time, but looking back on it now, it gave me a greater appreciation for the amount of effort and the quality of PvP that went into it all back then, and how notorious of a player you could be to the opposite faction, to the point where my name, Shardant at the time, was plastered across the forums by Horde players wanting revenge. Good times. Next we have this one from listener Disco Daisy, who tells us this. Hey, I've just started listening to your podcast. Right now I'm on episode 10. I love it and I've just been hammering through it while at work. I wanted to leave a little memory from my time in vanilla, so here goes. A friend of mine convinced me to buy World of Warcraft so he had someone to play with. He already had like a level 20 Night Elf Hunter, but when I joined he wanted to start fresh as well. He already told me about this class role of a tank, a tough warrior that keeps every monster on himself and just beats the mobs with an axe to keep everyone else safe. Oh boy, did I like the sound of that. We started off with me playing an orc warrior and my friend playing an undead mage. We started leveling and fell in love with dungeons as soon as we entered one. We wanted to find more people that loved dungeons as much as we did, and we found this thing called a guild. We started one of our own and wanted people to level in dungeons with us. This guild ended up being the biggest leveling guild on the server. I went from 10 to 60 in prot spec, just leveling in instances, which obviously took ages. Once we hit 60, we disbanded the guild, a very sad moment, and found our way to a guild that we could progress through the raids with. We were about 12 years old and became officers later on in the progression guild that we joined. I don't know who thought that was a good idea. We smashed through the content and it's some of the best memories in a game I've ever had. It also gave me a great way to learn English. Me being 12 years old and sitting on Ventrilo talking to all these people all over the world for 6 to 8 hours a day was awesome. Today, I still have a few people I chat with every now and then from that time, which is just amazing. I can't wait for vanilla to come out again. Keep up the great work. Best regards, Disco Daisy. And next we have another one from Disco Daisy. He sent in a couple of great ones, so I'm happy to read them back to back. And here we go again. Hello, I emailed you this morning about my memories of Classic and it got me thinking about what else I did during that time. So here goes again. I was a massive fan of wall jumping. I must have spent at least 50% of my game time just jumping up to places that were not meant to be accessible. One place I found was in the back of AQ down in Silithus. I'd jump up high on a mountain and down the other side where I found a huge flat desert. There were no sand dunes but just a flat sand-coloured floor that that went on for so long. So me and the friend that I was jumping with started running to see if there was anything there. After a few minutes, we found a hole. It looked like a glitched part of the grounds because it was just a 1 meter square hole that slowly shrunk in size. So it looked like a cone upside down. We couldn't see the bottom, but we're excited about this hole. Insert vagina joke here. We just had to jump in. We fell for a minute or two until the hole got so narrow that we landed and died. We then realized that we had to first jump up to the place where the hole was as ghosts, and then also wall jump all the way back from the hole after we res at the bottom. We could just take res sickness, but what was the fun in that? So we reached our corpses, resed, and started our way back to the top. It took me about 2 hours of small jumps until I finally reached the top. My friend, just a few jumps behind, misjumped when he was maybe 10 jumps from the top and fell all the way back down again and died. He then chickened out and took the res sickness. Another thing I thought of was jumping in Warsong Gulch. I just heard your Warsong Gulch episode. When I got the enemy flag to our base and when they had ours, I usually wall jumped to the roof where most people could not jump and they could easily be shot down while trying to reach us. Thanks again for the great podcast. Next we have this one from listener Cryptic, who says this. So back in Wrath of the Lich King, my friend and I would try to 2-man old content for an extra challenge. Most of it was easy, but as a rogue, me, and Resto Druid, him, we had some trouble with Razorgore in BWL. As most of you know, we didn't at the time, Razorgore can't be killed outright. You have to smash all the eggs. Once we found that out, we began theory crafting to find a way to make it work. First, we tried alternating with the orb. That clearly wasn't going to work. We kept getting interrupted and had to find another way. Then we tried having me use the orb while he kept rejuvenation on me to pull aggro on any new spawns. But after a while, the spawns were too much and he wouldn't be able to heal through it. Finally, we came up with a plan that led to our first 2-man kill. My friend would keep rejuvenation on both of us while he switched to travel form, ran up the ramp, and as the orcs got to the top of the ramp, he would jump down and run to the other side of the room and repeat the process, kiting the orcs around the room while I smashed all the eggs. I'd love to give a shout out to my boy Baka for all the awesome 2-man runs. And that's it for Memory Lane for today, but with all that done, now it's time for anger management. In anger management, we go through some of the listeners' angriest memories about vanilla World of Warcraft. And today we start with this epic submission from listener Das Moanator. And it's so long that it's going to be the only entry for anger management this week. But by gum, it is a doozy. So listen up. Here we go. Hi, Josh. I've been going back through some of the older episodes of Countdown to Classic, and I just listened to the episode in which you talked about how Alliance cities are so much better than Horde cities, and you had a bunch of forum posts from people who agreed with you. I was shocked. I always thought Horde cities were clearly much better than the Alliance ones, and I thought everyone else thought that too. You talked a lot about the music and atmosphere of the Alliance cities compared to the Horde cities, but let's look at them from a pure utility standpoint. Both factions have 2 cities in one continent and one in the other. The difference is that while the Horde's one city in Eastern Kingdoms is conveniently located in the north centre of the continent, the Alliance's one city in Kalimdor is entirely useless. It's literally located on an island off the northwestern tip of the continent and requires a boat ride plus a teleporter just to get to. All of the Horde cities, even those that are landlocked, are interconnected with Zeppelins, including one to their base camp in Stranglethorn Vale, whereas the Alliance cities only use boats, so all of their cities are on the coasts, and are therefore in less useful places, case in point, Darnassus, or they just don't have boat access, like Ironforge. The result is that the Horde has really good access to both continents, and the Alliance has good access to the Eastern Kingdoms, but virtually no access at all to the whole other continent. But wait, there's more. If I were to rate the cities from best to worst, I would put them something like this. Ironforge, Orgrimmar, Thunderbluff, Darnassus, Undercity, Stormwind. So yeah, I might put Ironforge, an Alliance city, as number 1. But the capital cities of each faction are the most important, and Orgrimmar is number 2, while Stormwind is the shittiest shit city of the lot. And I'll tell you why. Ironforge has a nice circular layout, where it's easy to get from the centre to any outer part of the city or vice versa, which generally makes it easy to get from any part of the city to any other part, and makes it very difficult to get lost. Orgrimmar isn't as nicely circular, but it's well laid out with the Flight Master atop the tall central building, and only 3 main sections to the city. There's no canals or shit to avoid, and everything is more or less where you expect it to be. For example, War Masters are in the War Quarter. It's kind of a wash between Thunderbluff and Darnassus. Both are reasonably well laid out, with well-defined and relatively easy-to-navigate sections, except that Thunderbluff has each quarter on a separate pillar, where you have to walk across a long bridge to get there and back, and Darnassus is basically the same thing, where it's built on a lake where you have to walk across bridges to get anywhere. Undercity is nice and circular, but the layout is horrible. The passages from the centre of the city to the middle ring of the city are at 0, 90, 180 and 270 degrees, but the passages from the middle ring to the outer ring of the city are at 45, 135, 225 and 315 degrees, which means it's a really long walk from the centre of the city to any of the outer quarters or vice versa. If you want to walk from the Magic Quarter to the Apothecarium, which are on opposite sides of the city, it's probably faster to walk all the way around the outer ring than to try to walk around the centre of the city, which is saying something because it takes a fucking long time to walk around the outer ring. The city also has a fucking elevator you have to use to get in or out of the city, and that green gooey shit all over the place. Though, to be fair, at least the walls of the green slime pits are slanted, so you can just walk up out of it if you fall in, unlike Stormwind. Okay, let's talk about fucking Stormwind. Whoever designed Stormwind should be shot. As soon as you walk into the entryway of the city, there's a giant bridge over a large gap and a canal. Of course, when I walked into the city for the first time, this was back in 2005 when computers had like 128 megabits of RAM, my computer immediately lagged like hell, and I of course fell off the bridge into the canal, because of course there aren't any railings or anything on that bridge. It took me like an hour, not helped by the lag, to figure out how to get out of there. Once I got into the city proper, it doesn't have 3 or 4 quarters like every other city, but fucking 6 of them. I had a quest to talk to the King of Stormwind, so I went to the largest building in the city, right in the centre of the city, which is where you'd expect the king to be. But no, it was the cathedral. So then I had to try looking in the other districts. Of course there's no bridges over the canals in any of the diagonal directions, so whenever I wanted to cross from, say, the Cathedral Square district to the Old Town district, I would fall off into the canal. I would have thought that the walls of the canal would be like Undercity, where they're low enough that you can just climb out, but no! Stormwind is too fucking stupid for that. So after I swam across the canal, I would realise I couldn't get back out, and I'd have to go looking for a staircase. Of course, it would have made too much sense to put staircases near the diagonals where people like me who were trying to take a shortcut could easily get out. The staircase instead is all the way at the end of the canal near the city wall. So I had to swim around forever looking for the damn staircase. Then, when I finally found it and got out, I ended up in the far corner of some other goddamn district than the one that I was even trying to get to. There's also monsters like fish and turtles in the canals that I had to fight my way through. I don't know who thought that was a good idea. Their names are yellow, but I didn't know at the time that that meant they wouldn't attack you. Also, the buildings in Stormwind are so dense that even when I asked a guard for directions and they put that marker on my map, I would still end up walking into the wrong buildings over and over again, unable to find who I was looking for. Then eventually I'd realise that they must be in a building on the other side of the row of buildings. But of course, there's no easy way to get from one side of the row of buildings to the other side, so I'd have to walk all the way down to the end of the row to go through the stone archway, then walk all the way back up to the other side of the row of buildings. But then, of course, since I'd gotten really close to my target, while I had been going through the buildings on the wrong side of the row, the marker would have been automatically erased from my map, so I'd realised I didn't know where the correct building was anymore and would have to walk around to find another guard to ask. Even once you became familiar with Stormwind and don't get lost like a noob, the fact that there's more districts than any other city, canals between every district, there aren't any bridges between diagonal districts, and if you fall into the canal you have to swim all the way to the fucking end of the canal to get out, means that Stormwind is by far the worst city in the game, regardless of their fucking music or whatever. It's hard to appreciate the atmosphere of the place when you spend the entire fucking time lost in the canals. Fuck Stormwind. Love the show and hope that last bit makes your anger management section. Now with that epic anger management submission out of the way, let's get to some cleanup on the show. As you know, we talk about a lot of things here on the show, and as a result, there's some listener feedback to go through. So if you ever feel that I've left something out, not clarified a point properly, got something wrong, or if you just want to add something to the conversation, then don't be shy in speaking up, as the following listeners have. And I'm so glad that they did. And we start with listener Lorenki, who says this. Hey, I just found out this podcast exists on Spotify and I absolutely love it. I'm currently on episode 12, so I don't know if my idea has been on the show yet, but I'm going to tell it anyway. I quit Legion soon after the second raid came out because I felt there was nothing to do and started to play old school RuneScape. I really love how old school RuneScape works in terms of new content. It has a polling system in which Jagex suggests different kind of new content, fixes and asks questions which subscribed players can answer, usually yes, no, or skip, and or write a long answer to. I really loved it, so players can choose which content is going to go into the game and which is not. Of course, this brings another suggestion from me. What if Classic is lived as vanilla first, and after reliving that original content, Blizzard starts a similar polling system as Jagex is doing at old school RuneScape, and new content can be brought forward, which players could vote for to bring into the Classic version and eventually lead to a different path than what we got with retail. And then there would be content to play after everything has been achieved in Classic. It's just a thought I've been wondering since I found out about the old school RuneScape polling system. And if you are able, or if you want to, I just want to shout out to my brother, Lor'earth, with whom I've played and shared almost every experience in World of Warcraft, and will many more when Classic comes out. We farmed mounts together, and if one of us got rare mounts, the other one would get one the next day. The first one we got was Alar, and I still feel bad for rolling higher that day. But ever since that day, we have shared the rares back and forth. And yes, Lorenki, to you I say I'm more than happy to obviously shout out to your brother, Lor'earth. Shout out to you if you do happen to be listening. Your brother very much so loves you, so that's fantastic. Next up, we've got this one regarding the Duskwood episode from listener Permadrunk, who says the following. Josh, I think Stitches is a level 39 elite in vanilla, not 24. He terrorizes low levels. And Permadrunk, I think you're exactly right. Obviously, when I go through the Wowpedia pages on everything, there's a bunch of information there that's been tweaked since the expansions have come, and sometimes I'm not quite sure what might be correct for vanilla and what might not be. But thank you so much for picking me up on that one. Yes, I got that one wrong. It squeezed by me. Very much so, I believe he is a level 24. Very well spotted there. Thank you. Next, we have this one from listener Viv, who says this about glancing blows from an earlier tanking episode. And they say this. So I don't know if someone has already said something about this or not, but in episode 28, information is given about weapon skills and glancing blows that isn't actually correct in my experience for warriors in vanilla. I've played a warrior in vanilla on like 3 different servers now. The way it worked in vanilla was different than the way it worked post-vanilla. In vanilla, the way it worked was that you had a 40% chance on any normal white damage hit to get a glancing blow, which would reduce them to 70% of a normal hit's damage. Each point in weapon skill above 300 increased the damage of a glancing blow by roughly 3%, meaning that at 310 weapon skill, your glancing blows do 100% of a normal hit's damage, meaning the 40% of the time you get glancing blows. They are the same damage at the other 60% of the time you get normal hits. However, glancing blows can never crit. But having 310 weapon skill is a huge deal for increasing your damage, because adding 30% damage 40% of the time is quite significant. On the show, it's said that glancing blows do 75% less damage 20% of the time and increases by 20% for each level you're below the target, which is not the case. Glancing blows are 40% of the time against a boss, usually level 63, and only 30% less damage, 70% of normal damage. What weapon skills does is basically make you do normal damage against the boss instead with glancing blows when you have 310 skill. So that's my rant for the day for anyone considering playing warrior that might be in the Discord or rogue, because it's the same for them as well. Which is why the low-level epic Edge Masters handguards were best in slot gloves until AQ 40 for Fury Warriors, because they gave plus weapon skill, and also why the swords in BWL were so good, like Maladath, and also why human and orcs are the best races, because they get plus weapon skill ratios, which makes it much easier to reach 310. Skill rules are the same no matter what. Obviously you wouldn't use some/all of those items that I mentioned on tanking warriors. Hit chance is the thing that changes based on what weapon you have equipped, because you have a higher penalty if you're dual wielding than if you are two-handing or main hand only. If I remember correctly, it's a 27% chance to miss with white attacks if dual wielding, and like around 8.5% to miss with yellow attacks. But it's way lower of a miss chance if you're holding a two-hander. I feel like I'm remembering it being something like 5% needed from gear rather than 8 to 9% plus. Anyway, I'll shut up now. There was otherwise good info in the episode. And Viv, I thank you so much for that amazing input. Thank you so much for those corrections. Viv has been an absolute all-star over at the Countdown to Classic Discord, and it's obviously entries like these that have made him quite the go-to authority on all things Warriors as well. So I do thank you for that pick-up there. And that's clean up for the day, and that's the episode, everyone. However, just before I let you go, I just want to give a few shout-outs here on the show. So shout-out to Cody, Democracy, Skyflow, Puny Dag, Scrooby, Tabs, and Yavan, and all the anonymous people who have bought me a coffee over at Ko-Fi. Thank you so much for your support of Countdown to Classic. It is greatly appreciated. And also a shout out to the members of the Countdown Council: Flozy B, Palfurus, Permadrunk, Rarebit, new council member Romani, the Anton, Wilson Ma, and Velarco. Thank you so much for your phenomenal support of the show. Countdown to Classic would not be the same without your support. And also a big thank you to supporters Bossman764, Hurlbert, Goodkisser, Myrtlebanks, Purgatos81, and Zudamos as always. Now you'll next hear from Countdown to Classic later in the week, when we'll be discussing the Law of the Barons, as well as conducting a special investigation on the show when Countdown to Classic plays a very special episode of Law and Order Man Crick's Wife Unit. So please do stay tuned for that one. It's a bit of fun. I've started streaming a lot more as well, everyone, so please do follow, subscribe, and tune in to twitch.tv/Countdown to Classic. And you can catch me around 4 p.m. this afternoon, being August 27th, if you're listening on release day, taking an interesting listener call all about thinking outside of the box with roles in dungeons, as well as 1.12 itemization. So I look forward to seeing a bunch of you then, and in more streams in the future. Have a great Monday, everyone. See you later.